Miss Marple and the man who wore blue at the funeral. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I'm so glad you're here. Isn't it remarkable how these quiet mysteries bring us together, no matter where in the world we're listening from? If you'd like, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I read every single one. Now, pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin. Chapter 1. A Stranger in Blue Among the Mourners. The rain had been falling steadily since dawn, turning the ancient churchyard of St. Faith's into a landscape of sodden earth and dripping yews. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her black umbrella with the practised ease of one who had attended far too many funerals in her 70-odd years, and reflected that there was something particularly melancholy about an English burial in the rain. "Dreadful weather for poor Thomas," murmured Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who stood beside her beneath the inadequate shelter of the Lychgate, "though I suppose he's past caring about such things now." Miss Marple nodded gravely, her keen blue eyes surveying the small gathering of mourners who had assembled despite the inclement weather. It had been exactly 1 week since the arrest of David Marsh, the former head gardener at Rosemount, and the village of St. Mary Mead was still buzzing with whispered conversations about poisoned petunias and forged wills. The death of Thomas Cottle, the under-gardener who had played such a crucial role in exposing the truth, seemed to have stirred up all the old gossip once again. "There's Inspector Slack," observed Mrs. Bantry, nodding toward a lean figure in civilian clothes who stood somewhat apart from the other mourners. "Paying his respects, I suppose, though he looks rather uncomfortable about it." Indeed, Inspector Slack appeared to be finding the occasion trying. He kept glancing about with the restless air of a man who would rather be anywhere else, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his mackintosh. Dr. Haydock was there too, his familiar bulk unmistakable even beneath his black overcoat, engaged in quiet conversation with the Reverend Mr. Pelfrey. "Poor Agnes Elwood," whispered Mrs. Bantry, indicating a heavily veiled figure in a deepest mourning who stood near the church door. "This must be dreadful for her. First all that business with Marsh and the Digitalis, and now poor Thomas dying so suddenly. They say his heart simply gave out from the strain of it all." Miss Marple observed the widow with interest. Agnes Elwood had been remarkably absent from public view since the arrest of her former employee, and this was her first appearance at any village gathering. Even through the heavy black veil one could see that her hands trembled as she clutched her prayer book, and when the funeral cortege appeared at the church gates she seemed to sway slightly on her feet. The small procession made its way slowly up the path, the pallbearers struggling somewhat with their burden in the persistent rain. Thomas Cottle had been a popular man in the village, despite his humble station, and there was genuine grief in the faces of those who had come to see him laid to rest. Miss Marple found herself thinking, not for the first time, how the events at Rosemount had touched so many innocent lives. "Good heavens," murmured Mrs. Bantry suddenly, "who on earth is that?" Miss Marple followed her friend's gaze and felt her eyebrows rise slightly. A man had appeared at the edge of the churchyard, and even in the grey drizzle he was unmistakably striking. He wore an immaculate overcoat of mid-blue wool, with a matching fedora pulled low over his eyes. There was something distinctly military in his bearing, the sort of upright posture that spoke of years of service, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint glint of what might have been a wartime ribbon half hidden beneath his lapel. The stranger moved with quiet confidence through the gathering, and Miss Marple noted several things about him with the automatic precision of long habit. The scent of pipe tobacco that seemed to cling to his coat. The way his shoes, though impeccably polished, bore traces of fresh mud that could not have come from the paved church path. The careful way he avoided making eye contact with any of the other mourners. As the coffin was carried into the church, the man in blue stepped forward, and Miss Marple saw that he carried a wreath. But what a curious wreath it was. The flowers were petunias, dyed an unusual shade of blue that seemed almost artificial in the grey light, and across them was draped a silk sash embroidered with the initials R.E. in silver thread. The effect upon Agnes Elwood was immediate and dramatic. She gave a sharp gasp that was audible even above the murmur of prayers, and her prayer book slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers to fall upon the wet stones. Inspector Slack had noticed the stranger too, and Miss Marple saw him begin to move purposefully through the crowd of mourners. But the man in blue seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. Even as Slack pressed forward, dodging between umbrellas and trying not to disturb the solemnity of the occasion, the stranger melted away into the drizzle beyond the Lychgate, with the practised ease of smoke dispersing in the wind. "Well, I never," breathed Mrs. Bantry. "Did you see how he simply vanished? Like something out of a penny novel." Miss Marple had indeed seen, and she had also noticed something else that made her frown thoughtfully. Where the blue wreath had been placed beside the church door, the silk sash had disappeared. A few moments of careful searching revealed only a single petal, its stem still moist with an oddly scented dye that she could not immediately identify. The service passed without further incident, though Miss Marple observed that Agnes Elwood remained in a state of barely controlled agitation throughout. Dr. Haydock had to assist her from the church, and there was considerable concern about her pallor and the way her hands continued to shake. It was during the modest reception in the church hall afterward that the final unsettling note was struck. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry had positioned themselves near the tea-urn, where they could observe the gradual dispersal of the mourners and engage in the sort of gentle conversation that often proved illuminating. "Such a business about poor David Marsh," Dr. Haydock was saying to the Reverend. "One can hardly believe that a man who tended those beautiful gardens could have been involved in anything so sordid. Poisoning old Herbert Elwood with digitalis from his own foxgloves, and all for the sake of that forged will." "The ways of temptation are mysterious," replied Mr. Pelfrey sadly, "though I must say, I never would have suspected David of such duplicity. He seemed such a straightforward sort of fellow." "It was the Petunias that gave him away in the end," added Dr. Haydock. "Poor Thomas Cottle spotted that someone had been interfering with the flower beds, and when he investigated further, he found evidence of the digitalis extraction. Brave man, to come forward as he did, though I fear the strain of it all proved too much for his heart." Miss Marple listened to this familiar recitation with half an ear, her attention focused instead on Agnes Elwood, who sat alone at a small table near the window. The widow had pushed back her veil, revealing a face that was not merely pale but positively grey, with what appeared to be terror rather than grief. As Miss Marple watched, Agnes opened her hymn book, and a small white card fluttered to the floor. The widow snatched it up quickly, but not before Miss Marple had seen her face go, if possible, even whiter. Agnes read the card with trembling hands, then looked about her with the hunted expression of a creature that knows itself to be pursued. The card slipped from Agnes's nerveless fingers, and Miss Marple, with the quick reflexes that had served her well in many a crisis, managed to intercept it before it could fall to the floor again. The message, written in a firm masculine hand, was brief but chilling. "Debts are not yet paid." For the first time since the troubles at Rosemount had begun, Jane Marple saw something in Agnes Elwood's eyes that was not grief, not guilt, not even despair, but pure, undiluted terror. Chapter 2. Petunias laid on a black coffin. The morning after Thomas Cottle's funeral dawned clear and bright, as if nature herself wished to apologise for the previous day's melancholy weather. Miss Marple was in her garden, deadheading her roses with the methodical precision that had made her the envy of the saint. Mary Mead Gardening Society, when Dr. Haydock appeared at her gate looking unusually grave. "Jane," he called, letting himself into the garden with the familiarity of long friendship. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about those curious blue petunias from yesterday." Miss Marple set down her secateurs and regarded him with interest. "Indeed, Doctor, I confess they have been much on my mind. Such an unusual shade, and that peculiar scent to the dye." Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "That's precisely what I wanted to discuss. I took the liberty of examining that petal you showed me after the service. Jane, I'm afraid I have some rather disturbing news. The blue dye contains traces of aconitine." "Aconitine?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose delicately. From Monkshood, you mean? Precisely. Not enough to be immediately dangerous from casual contact, but certainly enough to cause concern. Someone has been very clever indeed, using the dye to mask the presence of the poison. A person handling those flowers extensively, or perhaps inhaling the scent over time, might well begin to show symptoms. Miss Marple felt a small chill run down her spine. How very unpleasant, and how very deliberate. One does not accidentally incorporate aconitine into flower dye. My thoughts exactly. I've already telephoned Inspector Slack with my findings. He's promised to investigate the source of those unusual petunias, though I suspect he won't be particularly pleased about having another mystery on his hands so soon after the Rosemount affair. Indeed, Inspector Slack was not pleased. Miss Marple encountered him later that morning in the village, where he was making inquiries at the post office with the dogged persistence of a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said with resigned politeness. "I don't suppose you've remembered anything else about that fellow in the blue coat?" "I'm afraid not, Inspector, though I have been wondering about those petunias. Such an unusual variety, and that particular shade of blue is quite distinctive." Slack consulted his notebook with the air of a man who had already covered this ground thoroughly. "I've traced the purchase to a London nursery, Whitmore and Sons in Kensington. Ordered 3 weeks ago under the name of Mr. Beaumont, paid in cash, and collected by a gentleman fitting our mysterious stranger's description." "Mr. Beaumont," mused Miss Marple. "How interesting. And the address given?" "False, naturally. Some non-existent street in Mayfair. The nursery clerk remembered the customer particularly because he was so specific about the shade of blue he required. Insisted on seeing samples of different dyes before making his selection." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "A man who plans ahead, then. And one with some knowledge of horticulture, I should think." The inspector's expression suggested that he would prefer his criminals to be rather less forward-thinking. "Dr. Haydock tells me the dye was laced with poison. Monkshood, of all things, as if we haven't had enough trouble with poisonous plants recently." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Bantry at the lending library, where her friend was returning a particularly lurid detective novel and selecting another with the discerning eye of a connoisseur. "Jane, dear," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial whisper that the library seemed to encourage, "I've just had the most extraordinary encounter. I was at the post office, you know, collecting my magazines, when I couldn't help but overhear Agnes Elwood in rather heated discussion with her solicitor." "Oh!" Miss Marple's tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes were alert. She was saying something about sealed War Office documents, and how certain matters were supposed to remain confidential indefinitely. The solicitor, poor Mr. Pemberton, looked quite flustered. He kept saying something about statute of limitations and how some secrets couldn't be kept forever. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. How very curious. I wonder what sort of War Office business Agnes might have been involved in. That's just what I was thinking. She was quite agitated about it too. Kept looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be listening. Which of course I was, though I didn't mean to be indiscreet. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Of course not, dear. These things simply happen in a small village." That evening Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Agnes Elwood. She found the widow in her greenhouse tending to her plants with the sort of concentrated attention that suggested she was trying to keep her mind occupied. The sight that greeted Miss Marple was both beautiful and disturbing. Agnes had been cultivating petunias, and among the more usual varieties were several trays of the same unusual blue specimens that had appeared at the funeral. The flowers were magnificent, their colour rich and vibrant, but the soil around them gave off a faint, acrid smell that made Miss Marple's nose wrinkle slightly. "Good evening, Agnes," she said gently. "What lovely flowers you have here." Agnes started violently, nearly dropping the watering can she had been holding. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in. I was just... That is, I've been trying to keep busy. The evenings are so long now." Miss Marple approached the blue petunias with interest. "These are particularly striking. The same variety as the wreath yesterday, I believe." Yes, Thomas had been helping me with them. He was very good with flowers, you know. He helped me prepare the soil, adding various nutrients and other things to achieve just the right colour. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. It must be comforting to continue his work. Though I confess the scent is rather unusual. Is that from the soil preparation you mentioned? Agnes's hands began to tremble again. Yes, we used... That is, Thomas suggested we might add some root compounds to intensify the colour. Monkshood roots, actually. He said they would help the dye take properly. How very knowledgeable of him, Miss Marple murmured, though she was quite certain that Thomas Cottle, for all his gardening expertise, would never have recommended such a dangerous additive. I trust you've been careful handling them? Oh yes, very careful, though I must admit I've been feeling rather unwell lately. Dizzy spells and such. Dr. Haydock says it's the strain of recent events. Miss Marple made appropriate sympathetic noises, but her mind was working rapidly. It seemed increasingly clear that Agnes Elwood was being manipulated by someone with both botanical knowledge and access to dangerous substances. As if summoned by her thoughts, there came the sound of breaking glass from somewhere near the greenhouse. Agnes gave a small cry of alarm, and Miss Marple immediately moved toward the sound. A large pane of glass in the greenhouse wall had been shattered, apparently by a stone thrown from outside, but that was not what made Miss Marple's blood run cold. One of the trays of blue petunias had vanished, leaving only scattered soil and a few broken stems. "Oh dear," whispered Agnes, sinking onto a nearby garden stool. "Oh dear, oh dear." Miss Marple examined the broken window carefully. Caught on a jagged edge of glass was a small piece of dark blue fabric, the weave fine and expensive. She extracted it carefully with a handkerchief, noting its quality and the way it seemed to match the overcoat worn by the mysterious stranger. "Agnes," she said gently, "I think you'd better tell me about Robert Everard." The effect of the name was immediate. Agnes Elwood went completely white and began to shake so violently that Miss Marple feared she might collapse entirely. Who told you that name?" "The initials on the funeral wreath, my dear. R.E. And now someone has stolen your blue petunias, someone who left behind a piece of expensive blue fabric. I think it's time you told me the truth about your first fiancé." Agnes buried her face in her hands. "He was reported missing in 1944, shot down over Belgium, they said. But I've always wondered if he might have survived. He was so clever, so resourceful. And now, with these flowers and that man at the funeral, I'm afraid he's come back, Miss Marple. I'm afraid Robert is alive, and he's very, very angry." Miss Marple was about to respond when there came a sharp knock at the greenhouse door. Agnes looked up in terror, but it was only Inspector Slack, looking harried and slightly out of breath. "Mrs. Elwood, Miss Marple," he said, touching his hat. "I'm afraid I have some rather serious news. There's been an incident at the county jail. Someone attempted to assault David Marsh in his cell. The attack was made to look like a suicide attempt, but the prison doctor isn't convinced. A silk ribbon was found knotted around Marsh's neck, the same ribbon that went missing from yesterday's wreath." Agnes gave a small moan and swayed dangerously on her stool. Miss Marple steadied her with one hand while her mind raced with the implications of this latest development. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we are dealing with someone far more dangerous than we initially suspected. Someone who has access to the prison, knowledge of poisons, and a very long memory indeed. Chapter 3, The Vanishing Silk Wreath-Ribbon." The county jail at Much Benham was a grim Victorian edifice that seemed to absorb what little morning sunlight filtered through the autumn clouds. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Slack on his visit to David Marsh, her presence justified by her role as a witness to the previous day's events. The prison governor, a harried-looking man named Whitworth, met them at the gate with obvious relief. "Dreadful business, Inspector," he said, leading them through the echoing corridors. "In 30 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like it. The ingenuity of it, if you'll pardon the expression, was almost artistic." They found David Marsh in the prison infirmary, his neck bearing the angry red marks of the silk ribbon that had nearly cost him his life. The former gardener looked older than his years, his face bearing the grey pallor of a man who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. "Inspector," he said hoarsely as they approached his bedside, "I told the doctor, and I'll tell you. That weren't no suicide attempt. Someone tried to finish me off, and they very nearly succeeded." Slack consulted his notebook with the methodical air of a man who had learned not to take anything at face value. "Tell me exactly what happened, Marsh, from the beginning." David Marsh shifted uncomfortably against his pillows, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured throat. "I was in my cell just after evening meal. Reading me Bible, I was, trying to make sense of all this trouble I found myself in. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor, which weren't unusual, but these were different somehow. Quieter, like someone trying not to be heard." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What time would this have been, Mr. Marsh?" 7:15, near as I can tell. The chapel bell had just finished ringing. Next thing I knew, someone had slipped something around me neck from behind. Silk it was, smooth as anything but strong. Nearly did for me before I could cry out. Inspector Slack frowned. "The guards said they found you unconscious with a ribbon knotted around your neck. Made it look like you'd done it yourself." That's what they wanted it to look like. But I tell you, Inspector, I never would have done such a thing. I may be guilty of helping with that forged will business, but I ain't no coward. And besides," Marsh's voice dropped to a whisper, "before I lost consciousness, the man spoke to me." "What did he say?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Said I was just a pawn in a bigger game, and that pawns get sacrificed when they're no longer useful. But the thing is, Miss Marple, I recognise something about that voice. Military it was, officer class. Same as the man who taught me everything I knew about the forgery business." Slack's pencil paused above his notebook. "You're saying the person who attacked you was connected to your original instructions about the will?" "More than connected, Inspector. I think it was the same man. The one I called the officer in me head. Never knew his real name, but he's the one who showed me how to do the forgery. Told me exactly what to write and how to make it look authentic." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. "Mr. Marsh, did this officer ever mention anything about blue flowers, or about someone named Robert Everard?" Marsh's eyes widened. "Robert Everard? Aye, he mentioned that name once or twice. Said it was an old identity he'd used during the war, but that it was burned now. No good to him anymore. And the blue flowers. He had a thing about blue, he did. Always wore a blue scarf when he came to see me in the village. Said blue was the colour of loyalty, and loyalty was what he expected from those who worked for him." The prison governor had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. "Inspector, I should mention that we had a visitor asking to see Marsh yesterday afternoon. Said he was a chaplain from the next county come to offer spiritual comfort. Had proper credentials and everything. Though now I'm wondering if they might have been forged." "Describe this chaplain," Slack said sharply. "Tall gentleman, well-spoken. Wore a dark coat and a blue clerical scarf. Had that military bearing you sometimes see in men who've served. Said his name was Reverend Beaumont." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of recognition. The same name used to purchase the blue Petunias in London. "That's right," said Governor Whitworth. "Spent about 20 minutes with Marsh, then left quietly. It was perhaps an hour later that we found Marsh unconscious." Slack made several notes, then looked up at the ribbon that lay coiled on the bedside table. It was the same silk sash that had disappeared from the funeral wreath, but Miss Marple noticed something that made her lean closer for a better look. "Inspector, might I examine that ribbon more closely?" Slack handed it to her carefully, and Miss Marple held it up to the light from the infirmary window. "How curious! There appears to be a water stain here, quite deliberate by the look of it. And see how the silk has been treated in this particular spot." She held the ribbon at a certain angle, and suddenly faint markings became visible in the treated area. Numbers and letters, barely perceptible but definitely there. "Coordinates," breathed Inspector Slack. "Latitude and longitude, by the look of it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And unless I'm much mistaken, these are Belgian coordinates. The positioning and format suggests somewhere in the vicinity of Antwerp." Governor Whitworth looked from one to the other with obvious bewilderment. Belgium? What on earth would that have to do with an attempted murder in an English prison? Perhaps a great deal, Miss Marple murmured. Mr. Marsh, did your officer ever mention Belgium, or anything about jewels or precious stones? Marsh struggled to sit up straighter, his eyes showing a flicker of memory. Now that you mention it, he did once say something about unfinished business from the war, something about goods that had been relocated during the confusion of 1944, said there were debts to be collected and accounts to be settled. Inspector Slack was already reaching for the telephone. I need to contact the Belgian authorities immediately. If these coordinates are accurate, they might lead us to whatever this Everard fellow has been hiding all these years. As they prepared to leave the prison, Miss Marple turned back to David Marsh one final time. Mr. Marsh, I want you to think very carefully. Did the officer ever mention anyone specific from his past? Any names? Any particular grudges or vendettas? Marsh closed his eyes, concentrating. There was one thing. He said once that a woman had betrayed him during the war, cost him everything he'd worked for. Said her name was Agnes, and that someday she'd pay for what she'd done. Made me skin crawl the way he said it, like he'd been nursing that grudge for years and years. The drive back to St. Mary Mead was conducted largely in silence, both Miss Marple and Inspector Slack absorbed in their own thoughts. It was only as they reached the village that Slack spoke up. Miss Marple, I've been thinking about those coordinates. If they do point to some sort of wartime cache, and if this Everard character has been planning his revenge for years, then Mrs. Elwood could be in considerable danger. Indeed, Inspector, and I fear the danger may be more immediate than we realise. A man who can forge Chaplin's credentials and gain access to a county prison is not someone to be underestimated. As if summoned by their conversation, they encountered Doctor Haydock hurrying toward them from the direction of the post office, his face grave with concern. Slack, Miss Marple, thank goodness I've found you. I've just received some rather disturbing news from London. I sent inquiries about military records for a Robert Everard, and the response has just come back by telephone. And, Slack prompted, Robert Everard was indeed reported missing in 1944, but there's more to it than that. In 1947, his war medals and identity documents were reported stolen from the War Office archives. Someone with considerable skill and access made off with everything that could be used to establish or verify his identity. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into a new and more ominous pattern. Which means that our mysterious stranger could indeed be the real Robert Everard, armed with his own stolen credentials and nursing a grudge that has festered for over a decade. Or, added Inspector Slack grimly, someone else entirely, using a dead man's identity to settle old scores. Either way, I think it's time we had another conversation with Mrs. Agnes Elwood. And this time, I want the whole truth. Chapter 4, Whispers by the Churchyard Gate. The next morning found Miss Marple in the churchyard of St. Faith's, ostensibly to place fresh flowers on her late nephew's grave, but in reality to pursue a line of inquiry that had occurred to her during a restless night. The ancient church held many secrets within its weathered stones, and she had learned over the years that the most valuable information often came from the most unexpected sources. She was not surprised to find old Mr. Craddock, the church verger, sweeping the church steps with the methodical precision of a man who had been performing the same task for the better part of 40 years. At 93, Craddock was one of the oldest residents of St. Mary Mead, and his memory for village affairs was legendary. "Good morning, Mr. Craddock," Miss Marple called cheerfully. "Such a lovely morning after yesterday's rain." The old verger paused in his sweeping and touched his cap respectfully. "Morning, Miss Marple. Aye, it is that. Though I must say there's been some odd goings-on around here lately. Not that I'm one to gossip, mind you." Miss Marple approached with the encouraging smile that had loosened countless tongues over the decades. "Oh dear, nothing troubling, I hope." Craddock leaned on his broom and lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Well, since you ask, there's been someone about the church at night. Found candle wax dripped on the flagstones near the crypt entrance. I did. Fresh wax, mind you, not old. Someone's been down there with a light poking about where they've no business being. How very peculiar. When did you first notice this? 3 nights past it was. Came in early to prepare for morning service, and there it was, plain as day. White candle wax, expensive stuff too, not the cheap tallow we use for the regular services. And the crypt door, well, it had been disturbed. Scratches around the lock it had, like someone had been trying keys that didn't quite fit. Miss Marple felt a familiar tingle of excitement. I don't suppose you happened to mention this to Inspector Slack? Haven't seen hide nor hair of the inspector since poor Thomas's funeral. Thought about it, mind you, but then I said to myself, Albert, I said, what harm is there in someone paying respects to the dead, even if it is at an odd hour? Though now, with all this talk of strange men in blue coats and such, I'm beginning to wonder if I shouldn't have spoken up sooner. Mr. Craddock, you mentioned the crypt. Would that be the Everard family vault by any chance? The old man's eyes sharpened with interest. Why, yes, Miss Marple. Been sealed up for years, that has. Last burial was old Colonel Everard back in 1938. His grandson, young Robert, used to come round sometimes before the war, looking at the family memorials and such. Keen on family history he was, always asking questions about who was buried where and when. Miss Marple felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. Robert Everard, you say? This would be before he went missing during the war? That's right. Last time I saw him was early 1939, just before he enlisted. Came to pay his respects before shipping out, he said. Spent a good hour down in the crypt with a torch, making rubbings of the inscriptions on the tombs. Said he wanted to carry his family's memory with him wherever the war took him. How very touching. Tell me, Mr. Craddock, did young Robert ever mention anything about hiding places, or about keeping family treasures safe during wartime? The verger scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. Funny you should ask that. He did say something once about how the old families used to hide their valuables during times of trouble. Said the church crypts were traditional hiding places, being consecrated ground and all. Made quite a study of it, he did. Miss Marple thanked the helpful verger and made her way thoughtfully back through the village, her mind working rapidly. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she nearly collided with Mrs. Bantry, who was emerging from the post office with an armload of packages and a thoroughly excited expression. Jane, my dear, you'll never guess what I've discovered, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, juggling her parcels with practised ease. I've been doing a bit of research into parish records, and I've found something quite extraordinary about the Everard family. Indeed? How fascinating. Shall we repair to your morning room? I confess I have some information to share as well. 20 minutes later the two ladies were settled comfortably with tea, and Mrs. Bantry's findings spread across the table between them. The documents were old and yellowed, but the writing was still legible. You see here, Mrs. Bantry said, pointing to a particular entry, Robert Everard is listed in the parish register as missing, presumed dead as of September 1944. But look at this, Jane. There's no memorial stone for him in the churchyard, and no mention of him on the family monument inside the church. Miss Marple studied the records with interest. How very strange. Usually, even when a body cannot be recovered, the family would still commission some sort of memorial. Exactly what I thought. And there's more. I found the original will of Colonel Everard, Robert's grandfather. He left the bulk of his estate to Robert, with the provision that if Robert died without issue, everything would go to various charities. But here's the curious thing. The will was never probated after Robert's disappearance, which would mean that legally Robert's status remained uncertain, neither dead nor alive in the eyes of the law. Precisely. And if he were to return now, he would have a legitimate claim to the Everard estate, which included not just the family property, but also a collection of valuable antiques and jewellery that was never inventoried after the Colonel's death. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Mrs. Bantry, I believe we need to examine that crypt more closely. If I'm not much mistaken, someone has been using it as a hiding place, and recent events suggest that hiding place may have been disturbed. That afternoon, armed with Inspector Slack's grudging permission, and accompanied by the helpful Mr. Craddock, Miss Marple descended into the crypt beneath St. Faith's Church. The ancient stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and the air below was cool and slightly musty. The Everard vault was located in the oldest section of the crypt, its entrance marked by an elaborate iron gate bearing the family coat of arms. As Mr. Craddock had observed, there were indeed fresh scratches around the lock mechanism, and Miss Marple noticed something else that made her pause. "Mr. Craddock, might I borrow your torch for a moment?" The beam of light revealed what appeared to be modern scratches on the stone floor near the vault entrance. But more interesting still was a small piece of blue fabric caught on a rough edge of the iron gate. The weave and colour were identical to the fragment she had found at Agnes Elwood's greenhouse. "Someone has definitely been here recently," she murmured, carefully extracting the fabric with her handkerchief. "And unless I'm much mistaken, they've been making regular visits." Inside the vault itself, the disturbance was even more apparent. Several of the stone slabs that covered the ancient tombs had been moved slightly, leaving gaps that would be invisible to a casual observer, but quite obvious to someone looking for signs of tampering. "Miss Marple," called Mr. Craddock from deeper in the vault, "you might want to have a look at this." She found the old verger standing before the newest tomb in the vault, that of Colonel Everard. The stone covering had been shifted just enough to reveal a small cavity beneath, and the smell of recent disturbance hung in the air. "Someone's been using this as a hiding place," Miss Marple observed, "and recently too. See how the dust has been disturbed in a pattern that suggests regular access." Mr. Craddock nodded gravely. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were looking for. This wasn't random vandalism, Miss Marple. This was someone who knew the layout of the vault and had planned their visits carefully. As they prepared to leave the crypt, Miss Marple made one final discovery. Near the entrance, almost hidden in the shadows, she found traces of the same oddly scented dye that had marked the blue petunias. Someone had been bringing those poisonous flowers into the sacred space, and the implications of that discovery sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool air of the crypt. "Mr. Craddock," she said quietly, "I think it would be wise to change the locks on this crypt immediately, and perhaps you might consider asking Inspector Slack to post a watch. I fear our midnight visitor may return, and when he does, he may not be alone." As they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, Miss Marple was already planning her next move. The connection between Robert Everard and the church crypt was now established, but many questions remained. What had been hidden in the vault, and why was someone so determined to retrieve it? And most importantly, what was the connection between the hidden cache and the threats against Agnes Elwood? One thing was becoming increasingly clear. The mystery surrounding the man in blue was far more complex than a simple case of wartime identity theft. Someone was playing a very dangerous game, and the stakes appeared to be higher than anyone had initially suspected. Chapter 5 Midnight Footsteps on Rosemount Lane. Miss Marple had always been of the opinion that the most revealing conversations often took place in the small hours of the morning, when darkness provided both concealment and courage to those with secrets to share. It was with this philosophy in mind that she suggested to Mrs. Bantry that they might spend an evening keeping watch over Agnes Elwood's property. "A nocturnal vigil?" Mrs. Bantry had exclaimed with barely concealed delight. "How perfectly thrilling, Jane! Though I do hope we shan't encounter anything too dangerous." "I suspect, my dear Dolly, that danger is precisely what we are hoping to encounter, or rather, to observe from a safe distance." The evening in question was clear and cold, with a three-quarter moon that provided just enough light to make out shapes and movements, without being so bright as to expose their hiding place. Miss Marple had chosen a position behind the stone wall that bordered Rosemount Lane, affording an excellent view of both the main house and the various outbuildings that dotted the property. Mrs. Bantry, bundled in her warmest coat and armed with a thermos of hot tea, had taken to the adventure with the enthusiasm of a schoolgirl. "Do you really think he'll come tonight?" she whispered, as they settled into their hiding place. "If our mysterious visitor has been making regular nocturnal calls, as the evidence suggests, then yes, I believe he will. The question is what he hopes to accomplish. They had been in position for nearly 2 hours when Miss Marple heard the soft sound of footsteps on the gravel path. She touched Mrs. Bantry's arm gently, and both women peered carefully over the low stone wall. A figure was moving stealthily through the shadows near the garden gate. Even in the uncertain moonlight, the familiar blue overcoat was unmistakable. The man moved with the confident purpose of someone thoroughly familiar with the layout of the property, heading directly toward the cluster of outbuildings behind the main house. "The potting shed," breathed Mrs. Bantry. "He's going straight to the potting shed." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes tracking the figure's movements. She noted the military precision of his step, the way he avoided the patches of gravel that would crunch underfoot, and the practiced manner in which he produced what appeared to be a set of lockpicks from his coat pocket. The man worked on the shed door for perhaps 30 seconds before it swung open silently. A thin beam of torchlight appeared briefly, then was carefully shielded as he disappeared inside. "Now," whispered Miss Marple, "would be an excellent time to see what our friend finds so interesting about garden tools." Moving with surprising stealth for ladies of their years, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry crept closer to the potting shed. Through a grimy window they could see the figure methodically searching through what appeared to be drawers and cupboards with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. The thin beam of his torch played over garden implements, bags of fertilizer, and coils of twine before settling on something that made him pause. Miss Marple caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. "A record book of some sort," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, and from his reaction, it's exactly what he was hoping to find. The man spent several minutes examining the ledger, photographing certain pages with a small camera he produced from his pocket. Miss Marple could just make out his profile in the reflected torchlight, and what she saw confirmed her growing suspicions about their midnight visitor's identity. It was then that Mrs. Bantry, in her excitement to get a better view, inadvertently knocked over a small watering can that had been left beside the window. The metallic clang seemed to echo like thunder in the quiet night. The effect was immediate. The torchlight snapped off, and they heard the sound of rapid movement from within the shed. Miss Marple quickly switched on her own small torch, directing the beam through the window just as the man was preparing to flee through the rear door. "I say there," she called out in her most authoritative voice. "Might we have a word?" The figure froze for a moment, and Miss Marple got her first clear look at his face. The features were aristocratic, weathered by time and experience, with the sort of moustache favoured by military men of a certain generation. But it was the eyes that caught her attention, pale blue and filled with a mixture of desperation and cunning that made her instinctively step back. In that moment of mutual recognition, the man made his decision. He bolted through the rear door of the shed, the ledger clutched tightly under his arm. Miss Marple heard his footsteps pounding across the kitchen garden, heading toward the maze of pathways that led to the old orchard. "Should we follow him?" asked Mrs. Bantry, considerably out of breath from their brief chase. "I think not, dear, but we should certainly examine what he was so interested in finding." Inside the potting shed, Miss Marple's torch revealed a scene of methodical but careful searching. Drawers had been opened and their contents examined, but nothing appeared to have been damaged or randomly disturbed. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and where he was likely to find it. The space where the ledger had been was marked by a clear rectangle in the dust, and Miss Marple noted several other items that seemed to have been of interest to their visitor. A small wooden box had been opened and its contents examined, leaving behind only a few old seed packets and a collection of worn gardening gloves. But it was what she found on the floor that proved most illuminating. Dropped in his haste to escape, a small pocket diary lay open to a page dated 1944. The entries were brief but revealing, written in the same firm hand that had penned the threatening note to Agnes Elwood. "Belgium advance delayed due to supply issues," read one entry. "Antwerp contacts confirmed reliable for exchange operations." Another, dated several weeks later, noted, "Cache established at primary location." secondary sites prepared as contingency. Mrs. Bantry peered over Miss Marple's shoulder as she examined the diary. What do you suppose exchange operations means? I suspect, my dear, that it refers to the sort of activities that would have been highly irregular, if not outright illegal during wartime. The movement of valuable items from occupied territories, perhaps, or the establishment of hidden assets for post-war recovery. The diary contained several more entries of similar nature, including detailed notes about weights and measurements that suggested precious stones or metals, and a series of cryptic references to locations identified only by coded initials. "Look here," said Mrs. Bantry, pointing to an entry near the back of the diary. "What do you make of this? HE payments confirmed monthly. AE cooperation essential for long-term security. Those initials ... Herbert Elwood and Agnes Elwood," Miss Marple murmured. "It would appear that our mysterious Robert Everard has been maintaining some sort of financial arrangement with the Elwood family for quite some time." As they prepared to leave the potting shed, Miss Marple made one final discovery that sent a chill down her spine. Caught on a splinter of wood near the door was a single thread of blue fabric, but this time it was accompanied by something far more ominous. A small smear of what appeared to be the same oddly scented dye that had marked the poisonous petunias. "He's been handling those flowers regularly," she observed, "which means he's been exposing himself to aconitine for an extended period. A man in that condition might become increasingly unstable, increasingly desperate." The sound of approaching footsteps made both ladies freeze, but the measured tread that approached was reassuringly familiar. Inspector Slack appeared around the corner of the shed, slightly out of breath and looking distinctly annoyed. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, what on earth are you doing here at this hour?" "Conducting a small investigation, Inspector, and I'm pleased to report that we have made some rather significant discoveries." Miss Marple quickly summarised their observations and showed him the diary they had recovered. Slack examined the entries with growing interest, particularly the references to cached valuables and ongoing payments. "This explains a great deal," he said finally. "We've been looking at this case as a simple matter of revenge or blackmail, but it appears to be something far more complex. If Everard has been operating some sort of long-term scheme involving hidden assets and regular payments, then the recent murders may have been intended to protect a much larger criminal enterprise." As they made their way back toward the lane, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the man they had glimpsed in the potting shed. The desperation in his eyes, the careful way he had avoided direct confrontation, and most particularly, the evidence of prolonged exposure to a dangerous poison, all suggested someone operating under considerable pressure. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe our Mr. Everard is a man running out of time. Whether due to illness, discovery, or some other pressure we haven't yet identified, he's being forced to accelerate his plans. And that, I fear, makes him considerably more dangerous than we had initially supposed." Slack nodded grimly. "Then we'd better find him before he decides that Agnes Elwood has outlived her usefulness." Chapter 6. An Old War Medal, newly tarnished. The morning brought with it a telegram that would prove to be the key to understanding much that had seemed inexplicable about the recent events at St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack appeared at Miss Marple's door just after breakfast, his usually composed demeanour showing signs of considerable excitement. "Miss Marple, I've received word from the Military Records Office in London. That ribbon found around David Marsh's neck has been identified. It bears the Distinguished Service Order awarded to Flight Lieutenant Robert Everard in 1943 for extraordinary gallantry during bomber operations over occupied Europe." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "How very interesting, Inspector. And I suppose the medal itself has gone missing." "Precisely. According to the records, the complete set of decorations was among the items stolen from the War Office archives in 1947. But here's the curious thing. The theft was never properly investigated. The matter was classified and quietly buried, which suggests that someone in authority preferred not to draw attention to what had been taken, or perhaps to who might have taken it." Inspector Slack consulted his notes with the methodical air of a man who had learned to distrust first impressions. "There's more, Miss Marple. I've also received some rather disturbing intelligence about Flight Lieutenant Everard's service record. It seems that at the time of his disappearance, He was under investigation for desertion and suspected involvement in unauthorized removal of valuables from bombed museums and churches in occupied territories. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Art and artifacts that could be easily transported and converted to currency. How very practical for a man planning to disappear permanently. My thoughts exactly, but what I can't understand is why he would return now, after all these years. If he's been operating successfully under an assumed identity, why risk exposure by coming back to St. Mary Mead? Perhaps, Inspector, because something here belongs to him, or someone here knows something that threatens his carefully constructed new life. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to Agnes Elwood, this time with the express purpose of encouraging a complete confession. She found the widow in her morning room, staring listlessly out at the garden where David Marsh had once tended the beautiful flower beds that had ultimately betrayed him. "Agnes, my dear," Miss Marple began gently, "I think the time has come for complete honesty between us. The events of recent days suggest that there are aspects of your past that you have not yet shared, and I fear that your continued silence may place you in considerable danger." Agnes Elwood turned from the window, and Miss Marple was struck by how much the woman had aged in the past week. Her face was drawn and pale, her hands showed the tremor that had become increasingly pronounced, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had been carrying an unbearable secret for far too long. "You're right, of course," Agnes said quietly. "I should have told you everything from the beginning, but I was so frightened, and I hoped that if I said nothing, it would all simply go away." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair opposite Agnes, and waited with the patient silence that had encouraged countless confessions over the years. "I was engaged to Robert Everard in 1940, Agnes began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We met at a dance in Much Benham, and he was everything a young woman could want. Handsome, charming, and so brave in his uniform. We planned to marry when he returned from his next tour of duty." She paused, gathering courage for what was clearly the most difficult part of her story. But Robert never completed that tour. In late 1943 he simply vanished. Not shot down, not captured, just gone. The official report said he had deserted his post during a bombing mission over Belgium. There were whispers that he had been involved in some sort of black market operation, stealing from the very people we were supposed to be helping. Miss Marple made encouraging sounds but did not interrupt the flow of confession. Herbert Elwood was Robert's friend then. His closest friend, really. When the scandal broke, Herbert came to me with a proposition. He said he could make the whole thing disappear, could protect my reputation and my family's name, but it would cost money. A great deal of money. "And you paid him?" "Not me. My family paid him. Monthly payments year after year to ensure that no one in the village would ever learn about my connection to Robert Everard. When Herbert proposed marriage in 1945, I accepted because it seemed like the safest thing to do. He promised that as long as I was his wife, the secret would be safe." Miss Marple began to understand the complex web of deception that had entangled so many lives. "But Herbert continued to demand payments even after your marriage?" Agnes nodded miserably. "He said it was for my own protection, that there were people who might still come looking for Robert's associates. The monthly payments became part of our normal household expenses, hidden in the accounts as charitable donations or household maintenance. And recently someone has been demanding that these payments continue, even after Herbert's death." "Yes. About 6 months ago I began receiving letters. They were signed with Robert's initials, and they demanded that I continue the payments or face exposure of what they called the full truth about Herbert's wartime activities." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Agnes, I need you to think very carefully about this next question. Did Herbert ever tell you exactly what he knew about Robert's activities during the war?" Agnes was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "He said that Robert had been stealing from bombed churches and museums, taking religious artifacts and precious stones. But Herbert claimed he had evidence that Robert was not working alone, that there was an entire network of servicemen involved in the thefts. And Herbert had proof of this network. He said he had letters, photographs, and a complete list of everyone involved. He kept everything in a safe deposit box at the bank in Much Benham, along with samples of some of the stolen items that Robert had given him for safekeeping." Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. "And someone wants access to that evidence?" The letters I've been receiving, they don't just demand money. They demand that I retrieve Herbert's evidence and turn it over to them. But I can't do it, Miss Marple. The bank requires identification and documentation that I don't have. Herbert never told me where he kept the key or what name the box was registered under. At that moment there was a soft knock at the door and the parlour-maid entered with the afternoon post. Among the usual bills and circulars was a small envelope that made Agnes gasp with recognition. With trembling hands she opened it to reveal a black and white photograph, clearly taken during the war years. It showed a younger Agnes standing beside a man in RAF uniform, both of them smiling happily at the camera. Across the bottom of the photograph someone had written in red ink, "Remember Dunkirk?" "Agnes," Miss Marple said urgently, "where was this photograph taken?" "At the War Office in London. Robert had some sort of meeting there in early 1942, and I went with him. We were so happy then, so sure that the war would be over soon and we could be married." Her voice broke. "I don't understand what Dunkirk has to do with anything. Robert was never stationed there." But Miss Marple was beginning to understand a great deal. The photograph, the reference to Dunkirk, and the increasingly desperate tone of the threats all pointed to someone who was running out of time and options. "Agnes, I want you to pack a bag immediately. You're going to stay with Mrs. Bantry until this matter is resolved." "But why? What's wrong?" "Because, my dear, I believe our mysterious correspondent is not simply interested in money, or even in recovering stolen evidence. I believe he's trying to eliminate everyone who can connect him to his wartime activities, and that photograph suggests he's been planning this for a very long time indeed." As Agnes hurried upstairs to pack, Miss Marple examined the photograph more closely. The quality was excellent, the sort of official portrait that would have been kept in military files. But it was the background that caught her attention. Behind the smiling couple, partially visible, was a sign that read Special Operations Executive. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. Robert Everard had not been a simple deserter or opportunistic thief. He had been involved with the Special Operations Executive, the secret organisation responsible for supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe. If he had been stealing artefacts and establishing hidden caches, he had been doing so with official sanction and considerable resources at his disposal, which meant that the current threats against Agnes Elwood were not the desperate actions of a common criminal, but the calculated moves of a trained intelligence operative who had spent decades perfecting the art of deception and elimination. Chapter 7, Secrets Behind the Stained Glass Window. The decision to search the church crypt by night was not one that Miss Marple made lightly, but the events of the previous day had convinced her that time was rapidly running out. Inspector Slack had agreed to the venture with considerable reluctance, and only after Miss Marple had pointed out that their quarry was clearly becoming more desperate and therefore more dangerous with each passing hour. "I still think we should wait for daylight," Slack grumbled as they met at the Lychgate just before midnight. "Creeping about in crypts in the dead of night seems more like something out of a penny dreadful than proper police work." "Perhaps, Inspector, but our mysterious visitor has shown a marked preference for nocturnal activities. If we hope to discover what he has been seeking in the Everard vault, we must examine it when he believes himself to be unobserved." Mr. Craddock, the elderly verger, had provided them with keys and a detailed explanation of the crypt's layout. He had also, rather surprisingly, insisted on accompanying them, despite his advanced age. "Been looking after this church for 40 years, he had declared stoutly. "If there's secrets hidden in God's house, then I reckon I've got a right to know what they are." The crypt was even more atmospheric by torchlight than it had been during their previous daytime visit. The ancient stones seemed to absorb the light, creating pockets of impenetrable shadow that could have concealed almost anything. Miss Marple found herself thinking that it was exactly the sort of place where a man like Robert Everard would choose to hide his most precious secrets. They made their way directly to the Everard vault, where the recent disturbances were even more apparent under the focused beam of Inspector Slack's electric torch. The stone slabs had definitely been moved, and there were clear signs that someone had been conducting regular and systematic searches of the tomb cavities. "Look here," said Mr. Craddock, pointing to a section of the wall near the newest tomb. "That panel's been tampered with, that has. See how the mortar's been chipped away around the edges." Miss Marple examined the area he indicated and realised that what she had taken for solid stone was actually a carefully disguised removable panel. The craftsmanship was excellent, designed to be invisible to casual observation but accessible to someone who knew exactly what to look for. "Inspector, I believe we may have found our answer to the mystery of the Angel's Window." Slack looked puzzled. "Angel's Window?" "From the diary we recovered last night. One of the entries mentioned a secret cache hidden under the Angel's Window. I believe this refers not to an actual window but to the stained glass panel above this tomb." They directed their torches upward and saw that indeed, directly above the Everard vault, there was a beautiful stained glass window depicting the Archangel Michael. The coloured glass caught their torchlight and threw rainbow patterns across the ancient stones. But how would one access anything behind a stained glass window? Slack wondered aloud. Mr. Craddock, who had been examining the wall more closely, provided the answer. "This panel here, it's on hinges. Disguised hinges, mind you, but hinges nonetheless. And see this little depression in the stone? That's where you put pressure to open it." Working together, they managed to swing the hidden panel open, revealing a cavity behind the stained glass that had clearly been designed as a hiding place. Miss Marple's torch beam illuminated a collection of items that made her draw in her breath sharply. There were several sets of forged identity documents, each bearing different names but all with the same photograph of a man who was unmistakably Robert Everard. A canvas pouch contained what appeared to be cut gemstones of considerable value, their faceted surfaces throwing back the torchlight in brilliant flashes of colour. And wrapped in oiled cloth was an object that made Inspector Slack whistle low under his breath. "A Webley revolver," he said, carefully lifting the weapon without disturbing any potential fingerprints. "Service issue by the look of it, and recently cleaned and oiled." Miss Marple was more interested in the gemstones, which she examined with the practised eye of someone who had spent many years appraising donated items for church jumble sales. "These are not the sort of stones one finds in ordinary jewellery, Inspector. The cuts are too precise, the clarity too perfect. These are the work of master craftsmen." "Stolen from European museums and churches, no doubt," Slack said grimly, "just as we suspected." But it was Mr. Craddock who made the most disturbing discovery. As he swept his torch around the hidden cavity, the beam caught something that glinted metallically near the back of the space. "There's more here," he said, reaching carefully into the recess. "Looks like a small metal box." The box, when opened, revealed a collection of photographs and documents that told a chilling story. There were pictures of bombed churches and museums, with detailed notes about which artefacts had been removed and where they had been taken. There were lists of names, both military personnel and civilians, who had apparently been involved in the systematic looting operation. "Good Lord," breathed Inspector Slack as he examined one of the documents. "This isn't just simple theft. This was organised on a massive scale, with official backing and detailed planning." Miss Marple was studying one of the photographs with particular interest. "Inspector, look at this image. It shows the interior of a church that appears to have been deliberately damaged to cover the theft of specific items. The destruction is too selective to have been caused by bombing alone. But it was the final item in the hidden cache that provided the most crucial piece of the puzzle. Wrapped in silk and carefully preserved was a letter bearing the letterhead of the Special Operations Executive dated September 1944. The letter was addressed to Operation Magpie and authorised the bearer to secure and relocate items of cultural and monetary value from areas of active engagement, with full authority to establish secure storage facilities pending post-conflict recovery operations. "Operation Magpie," Miss Marple murmured. "How very appropriate. Magpies, after all, are notorious for collecting shiny objects." Inspector Slack was reading the authorization letter with growing amazement. This suggests that the theft operation was not only official, but that it was designed to be temporary. These items were supposed to be returned after the war. "But they never were," observed Mr. Craddock, "which means that someone decided to keep them for personal profit." Miss Marple was examining the hidden cavity more closely, noting that despite the valuable items it contained, there were clear signs that other objects had been removed recently. The dust patterns and slight discoloration of the stones suggested that the cache had once held considerably more than what they had found. "Someone has been making withdrawals," she observed. "Regular withdrawals by the look of it, which suggests that our Mr. Everard has been using this hiding place as a sort of personal bank vault." As they prepared to leave the crypt, Inspector Slack made arrangements for a silent alarm to be installed that would alert the police station if anyone attempted to access the Everard vault during the night hours. "If he returns for more of his cash, we'll be ready for him," Slack said with satisfaction. But Miss Marple was less optimistic about their chances of catching their quarry through such straightforward means. "Inspector, I fear that a man who has successfully evaded detection for over a decade is unlikely to be caught by conventional police methods. We are dealing with someone who has been trained in deception and concealment, someone who thinks several moves ahead of his opponents." As they emerged from the church into the cool night air, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the implications of what they had discovered. The cache behind the Angel's window had revealed not just the extent of Robert Everard's wartime activities, but also the sophisticated planning that had gone into his long-term survival strategy. "There's one thing that troubles me, Inspector," she said, as they walked back toward the village. "If Robert Everard has had access to a fortune in stolen gems for all these years, why has he continued to demand monthly payments from Agnes Elwood? A man with that kind of wealth would hardly need to blackmail a widow for her modest household allowance." Inspector Slack considered this question as they paused at the Lychgate. Perhaps the payments weren't really about money. Perhaps they were about control, about keeping Agnes Elwood frightened and compliant. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, they were about something else entirely, something we haven't yet discovered. The next morning brought news that would prove Miss Marple's instincts correct once again. Dr. Haydock appeared at her door with a telegram that had arrived at the police station during the night. "The gems we found have been appraised by an expert in London," he announced. "They're worth approximately £30,000. But here's the interesting part. One of the most valuable stones described in Everard's documentation is missing. A large sapphire that was apparently the centrepiece of the entire collection." Miss Marple smiled with the satisfaction of a theory confirmed, which explains why our mysterious visitor has been making regular withdrawals from his cache. He's been searching for that missing sapphire, and I suspect he believes Agnes Elwood knows where it is. Chapter 8. Chase through the Boxwood Maze. The annual charity fete at Rosemount had been Agnes Elwood's idea, proposed as a way to raise funds for the local War Widows Relief Fund, and Miss Marple suspected as an attempt to restore some measure of respectability to her reputation after the recent scandals. The event was scheduled for a clear October evening, with paper lanterns strung throughout the gardens and various stalls arranged on the main lawn. Miss Marple had arrived early, ostensibly to help with the final preparations, but actually to position herself where she could observe the proceedings. Inspector Slack was present as well, though he had taken care to dress in civilian clothes and maintain the appearance of a casual visitor rather than a policeman on duty. "Lovely evening for it," remarked Mrs. Bantry, who was managing the jam and preserve stall with her usual efficiency. "Though I must say, Agnes looks frightfully nervous. She's been checking the garden paths every few minutes as if she expects someone unwelcome to appear." Indeed, Agnes Elwood did appear to be under considerable strain. She moved through the gathering with the forced cheerfulness of a hostess who would rather be anywhere else, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd of villagers who turned out to support the charitable cause. The fete proceeded pleasantly enough through the early evening hours. Children played games on the lawn while their parents browsed the various stalls and enjoyed cups of tea served from the large marquee that had been erected near the house. Dr. Haydock had organised a small exhibition of local historical artefacts, and the Reverend Mr. Pelfrey was conducting tours of the renovated rose garden. It was just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grounds, that Miss Marple noticed a figure moving near the entrance to the famous Boxwood maze that was one of Rosemount's most distinctive features. Even in the golden evening light, the familiar blue overcoat was unmistakable. She caught Inspector Slack's eye and nodded discreetly toward the maze. The inspector, understanding her signal immediately, began to move casually in that direction, while Miss Marple positioned herself to observe from a different angle. The maze at Rosemount was an elaborate Victorian creation, with paths that wound through towering walls of perfectly maintained boxwood hedging. During the day, it was a delightful puzzle for visitors to solve, but in the gathering dusk it took on a more sinister aspect. The shadows between the hedge walls were deep and impenetrable, and the sound of footsteps on the gravel paths seemed to echo from all directions at once. Miss Marple watched as the figure in blue moved confidently into the maze, clearly familiar with its layout. Inspector Slack waited a few moments, then followed, moving with the careful precision of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. "Jane, what's happening?" whispered Mrs. Bantry, who had noticed the sudden tension in her friend's demeanour. "I believe, dear Dolly, that our mysterious visitor has finally decided to make his move. Inspector Slack is in pursuit, but I fear this may prove more complicated than a simple arrest." The sound of running footsteps suddenly echoed from within the maze, followed by a sharp cry that might have been either alarm or anger. Miss Marple made a quick decision and began moving toward the maze entrance herself, despite Mrs. Bantry's whispered protests about the danger. The interior of the maze in twilight was indeed a disconcerting place. The high hedge walls blocked out most of the remaining daylight, and the gravel paths crunched underfoot, with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. Miss Marple moved carefully but purposefully, relying on her memory of the maze's layout from previous visits to Rosemount. She could hear the sounds of pursuit somewhere ahead of her, the heavy breathing of men engaged in a chase through the winding passages. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of movement through gaps in the hedging, but the maze was designed to confuse and misdirect, and it was impossible to determine exactly where the chase was leading. It was Mrs. Bantry who provided the first real indication of what was happening. Despite Miss Marple's warnings about staying clear of the maze, Dolly had followed her friend and now came hurrying along one of the parallel paths, having lost her hat to a particularly aggressive branch. "Jane," she called in a stage whisper, "I can see them. Inspector Slack has cornered someone near the centre of the maze by the fountain." Miss Marple adjusted her course accordingly, following the sound of voices that was now becoming audible through the hedge walls. She arrived at a junction of paths just in time to see Inspector Slack confronting a tall figure in RAF uniform who stood with his back to the central fountain. But this was not quite the scene she had expected. The man facing Inspector Slack was indeed wearing the familiar blue overcoat, but something about his posture and bearing seemed different from the figure they had been pursuing. This man stood upright and confident, with none of the furtive wariness they had observed in their mysterious visitor. "Flight Lieutenant Peter Langham, Military Intelligence," the man was saying, producing an identification card from his breast pocket. "I've been tracking Robert Everard since 1948, Inspector. I'm afraid you've been pursuing the wrong man." Inspector Slack examined the credentials with obvious skepticism. Military Intelligence? And what exactly brings military intelligence to a village charity fete? "The same thing that brought you here, Inspector, Robert Everard. We've had intelligence suggesting that he's been operating in this area, using his wartime cash to fund activities that pose a threat to national security." Miss Marple stepped into the circle of light cast by the decorative lanterns around the fountain. "How very interesting, Flight Lieutenant. Though I confess I'm curious about how you came to be wearing the same distinctive overcoat that our mysterious visitor has been sporting." Langham's confident demeanour flickered slightly. "I acquired it from Everard's former landlady in London. It seemed like useful camouflage, allowing me to move in the area without attracting attention." "And the blue petunias at Thomas Cottle's funeral? Were those part of your camouflage as well?" Before Langham could answer, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the maze, sharp and unmistakable in the evening air. Langham spun toward the sound, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat pocket, but he was too late. A second shot rang out and Langham staggered, clutching his shoulder as blood began to seep through his fingers. "Down!" shouted Inspector Slack, drawing his own weapon and scanning the hedge walls for signs of the shooter. Miss Marple dropped to her knees beside the wounded man, pressing her handkerchief against the bullet wound to slow the bleeding. "Flight Lieutenant Langham, can you tell us where the shots came from?" The centre pavilion," Langham gasped, nodding toward a small ornamental structure that was barely visible through the maze's final ring of hedging. "He's been watching us, waiting for the right moment." Inspector Slack was already moving toward the pavilion, his revolver drawn and ready. Miss Marple helped Langham to a sitting position against the fountain's edge, and then made a discovery that sent a chill through her. Protruding from Langham's coat pocket was the unmistakable glint of a large cut stone. The missing sapphire from Everard's collection was in the possession of the very man who claimed to be hunting him. "Flight Lieutenant," she said quietly, "I think you have some explaining to do." Langham's face had gone pale, whether from blood loss or from the realization that his deception had been discovered. Miss Marple could not tell. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I had to take it. It's the only proof we have of what Everard really did during the war." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "it's the only thing valuable enough to make this entire elaborate charade worthwhile." The sound of footsteps on gravel announced Inspector Slack's return, but he was not alone. With him, walking calmly and apparently unharmed, was a figure that Miss Marple recognised immediately, despite never having seen him clearly before. Robert Everard was a man of perhaps 55, with prematurely grey hair and the sort of bearing that spoke of military training and long years of command. He was indeed wearing a blue overcoat, but it was clearly a different garment from the one worn by Langham, older and more worn, but of excellent quality. "Inspector Slack, Miss Marple," Everard said, with a slight bow that was almost courtly in its formality. "I believe it's time we had a proper conversation, though I'm afraid our friend Mr. Langham here has been somewhat economical with the truth about his reasons for being in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple looked from the wounded Langham to the composed Everard, and felt the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The chase through the maze had indeed led to a revelation, but not the one any of them had expected. Chapter 9, Confession at the Lychgate. The events at the charity fete had concluded with more drama than anyone could have anticipated. Flight Lieutenant Langham had been taken to hospital under police guard. The missing sapphire recovered from his possession, and the genuine Robert Everard had disappeared once again into the night despite Inspector Slack's best efforts to detain him. Miss Marple had spent the following day in quiet contemplation, piecing together the complex web of deception that had entangled so many lives. It was therefore with a sense of inevitability rather than surprise that she received the unsigned note that was slipped under her door, just as the church bells were striking 11 o'clock that evening. The message was brief and written in the same firm hand that had authored the threats to Agnes Elwood. "Midnight at the Lychgate. Come alone if you wish to learn the truth." Miss Marple considered telephoning Inspector Slack, but something in the tone of the message suggested that this was to be a final reckoning rather than another attempt at concealment. She wrapped herself in her warmest coat, slipped a small torch into her pocket, and made her way through the silent village streets towards St. Faith's Church. The Lychgate stood in shadow, its ancient timbers dark against the starlit sky. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes before midnight, and was not surprised to find that she was not the first to arrive. Agnes Elwood stood beneath the gate's peaked roof, clutching what appeared to be a legal document in her trembling hands. "Agnes, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I take it you received a similar invitation." "He said to bring Herbert's will," Agnes whispered, her voice barely audible in the night air. "The real will, not the forgery that David Marsh created. He said if I brought it, this would all be over." Before Miss Marple could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows beyond the churchyard wall. Robert Everard moved with the measured pace of a man who was no longer running from anything, and in the pale moonlight Miss Marple could see that he looked considerably older and more frail than he had appeared during their brief encounter at the maze. "Mrs. Elwood, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "Thank you for coming. I'm afraid this conversation is rather overdue." Agnes shrank back against the wooden gate, but Everard made no move to approach her. Instead, he leaned heavily against the stone wall that bordered the churchyard, and Miss Marple noticed that his breathing was laboured and irregular. "You're ill," she observed. Everard smiled wryly. "Dying, actually. A combination of advancing years and prolonged exposure to certain botanical toxins. It seems that my own cleverness with poisonous dyes has finally caught up with me." "The aconitine from the blue petunias," Miss Marple said with understanding. "You've been handling them for months, preparing your elaborate revenge." "Revenge is such an ugly word, Miss Marple. I prefer to think of it as settling accounts." Everard's voice carried the precise diction of an educated man, but underneath it was the rasp of someone whose time was running short. "Though I must confess, recent events have forced me to reconsider both my methods and my motives." Agnes found her voice at last. "Robert, why? Why couldn't you just leave us in peace? Herbert is dead, I'm alone, and the past is the past." Everard turned to look at her directly for the first time since his arrival. "Because, my dear Agnes, the past is never truly past when it's built on lies and theft. And because Herbert Elwood was not the victim you believe him to have been." Miss Marple felt a familiar chill of understanding. "Herbert was your partner, wasn't he? Not your blackmailer, but your accomplice." "Herbert Elwood was many things, Miss Marple, but he was not the simple village solicitor he pretended to be. During the war, he served as my civilian contact for Operation Magpie. He helped arrange the documentation for our, shall we say, cultural preservation activities. And when I was forced to disappear in 1944, Herbert agreed to maintain custody of certain items until I could safely return to claim them." Agnes stared at him in shock. "That's impossible. Herbert was never involved in anything like that. He was a respectable man, a pillar of the community." "Herbert was a very skilled embezzler who saw an opportunity to profit from wartime chaos," Everard replied with bitter amusement. "When I returned to England in 1947, I discovered that not only had he refused to return my property, but he had been systematically selling pieces of it to fund his comfortable lifestyle. The monthly payments he demanded from you were never blackmail, Agnes. They were his fee for keeping me away from what was rightfully mine." Miss Marple nodded as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. "And when Herbert died, you expected to be able to reclaim your property. But you discovered that he had hidden it so well that even his widow couldn't find it." "Precisely. The old fox had cached everything in safe deposit boxes and hidden accounts scattered across 3 counties. The only way to access them legally was through the proper documentation, which Herbert had deliberately kept from Agnes." Agnes was shaking her head in disbelief. "But the will that David Marsh forged, the one that gave me Herbert's estate, was actually closer to the truth than the official version Herbert had filed," Everard finished. "The forged will was based on documents that Herbert had hidden, documents that acknowledged certain wartime debts and obligations. David Marsh was following my instructions, but he thought he was helping to expose the truth, not conceal it." "Then why did you try to kill him?" Inspector Slack's voice cut through the night air as he emerged from behind the church, having clearly been observing the conversation from concealment. Everard sighed deeply. "I didn't try to kill David Marsh, Inspector. I was trying to prevent someone else from killing him. Someone who had a great deal more to lose than I did if the truth about Operation Magpie came to light." "Flight Lieutenant Langham," Miss Marple said with sudden clarity. "Peter Langham was never military intelligence, Miss Marple. He was Herbert Elwood's nephew, a former RAF pilot who had been court-martialed for theft and desertion in 1945. Herbert had been supporting him for years, and when Herbert died, Langham realised that his comfortable allowance was about to disappear. He came to St. Mary Mead to find Herbert's hidden assets, but he needed to eliminate anyone who might expose his own criminal activities." Agnes sank onto the stone bench beside the Lychgate, the legal document fluttering from her nerveless fingers. "Then Thomas Cottle was murdered by Langham when the gardener discovered him searching the grounds at night. Thomas had recognised him from his previous visits to Herbert, visits that had supposedly been social calls from a devoted nephew." Inspector Slack stepped forward, his notebook already in hand. "And you decided to take justice into your own hands?" Everard began to cough, a harsh sound that echoed off the church walls. When he recovered his breath, his voice was noticeably weaker. "I decided to prevent further murders, Inspector. Langham was planning to kill Agnes as soon as he could force her to sign over Herbert's assets to him. The threats, the poisoned flowers, the attacks on David Marsh, they were all designed to terrorise her into compliance." "So you posed as yourself," Miss Marple said, with a note of admiration in her voice. "You allowed Langham to believe that you were the mysterious figure he needed to eliminate, while actually protecting the people he intended to harm. It seemed like poetic justice, and it gave me the opportunity to recover what was mine by rights, while ensuring that Agnes would not suffer for Herbert's crimes." Agnes looked up at him through her tears. "Robert, I never knew. About Herbert, about any of it. I thought I was protecting myself from scandal, but I was actually protecting a criminal." Everard moved slowly toward the bench and with obvious effort lowered himself to sit beside her. "Agnes, my dear, you were as much a victim as anyone else. Herbert used your reputation and your fear to shield his activities. The monthly payments you made were funding not just his lifestyle, but his nephew's as well." "What happens now?" Agnes asked quietly. Everard reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather portfolio. "This contains the locations and access codes for all of Herbert's hidden accounts, as well as the documentation needed to prove that the assets legitimately belong to the victims of wartime theft. I had intended to reclaim them for myself, but I find that dying changes one's perspective on such matters." He handed the portfolio to Inspector Slack. "I suggest that the contents be used to establish a proper fund for war widows and refugees, as was originally intended. As for the monthly payments that Agnes has been making, I believe she will find that Herbert's estate contains more than enough to reimburse her for every penny." Miss Marple watched as Robert Everard struggled to his feet, his face grey with exhaustion and pain. "There is one more thing, Inspector. You'll find that Flight Lieutenant Langham has been using Herbert's old contacts to sell stolen artifacts on the black market. The evidence is in the safe deposit box at the Much Benham Bank, along with a complete list of his criminal associates." As Everard turned to leave, Agnes called out to him, "Robert, wait. What you said earlier about dying." He paused and looked back at her with something that might have been his old affection. "The doctors give me perhaps a month, possibly less. The aconitine poisoning has damaged my heart beyond repair." "Then why," Agnes asked, tears streaming down her face, "why didn't you just let it all end quietly?" For the first time since his appearance at the Lychgate, Robert Everard smiled with genuine warmth. "Because, my dear Agnes, some debts can only be paid with the truth, and because I once loved you enough to want you to know that you are never the villain in this story." He walked slowly toward the darkness beyond the churchyard, pausing only to say, "Tell the authorities that Robert Everard died, as he was reported to have died, in 1944. The man who leaves here tonight is simply someone who stayed too long at a reunion." Chapter 10. Tea, Truth, and a Tidy Garden. A month had passed since the dramatic revelations at the Lychgate, and autumn had settled gently over St Mary Mead with the sort of mellow beauty that made one forget the darker events of recent weeks. Miss Marple stood in the rose arbour at Rosemount, admiring the careful restoration work that had transformed Agnes Elwood's garden from a place of secrets and sorrow into something approaching its former glory. The rose bushes, freed from the taint of David Marsh's desperate schemes, had been replanted and were already showing signs of new growth. The greenhouse had been thoroughly cleaned and restocked with perfectly ordinary plants, and the famous blue petunias had been replaced with cheerful yellow marigolds that posed no threat to anyone's health. "It's remarkable what a difference a month can make," observed Mrs. Bantry, who was arranging chairs around a small table in preparation for the modest garden tea that Agnes was hosting for a select group of friends. "The whole atmosphere of the place has changed. Indeed, Rosemount did seem lighter somehow, as if the lifting of its buried secrets had allowed fresh air to circulate through rooms that had been closed off from honest sunlight for far too long." Agnes herself appeared transformed, moving about her garden with the confident grace of a woman who no longer carried the weight of hidden guilt. Inspector Slack arrived just as the church bells were striking 3 o'clock, looking considerably more relaxed than he had during the height of the investigation. He accepted a cup of tea from Agnes with the courteous manner of a man who had learned to separate personal feelings from professional duties. "Any final word on Flight Lieutenant Langham?" Mrs. Bantry inquired with a sort of careful casualness that indicated burning curiosity held barely in check. "Sentenced to 15 years for murder and conspiracy," Slack replied, settling into his chair with obvious relief. The evidence from Herbert Elwood's safe deposit boxes provided a complete picture of his criminal activities going back to the end of the war. Quite an extensive operation, actually. He'd been selling stolen artifacts to private collectors for nearly a decade. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, and David Marsh, released yesterday, actually, sentence reduced to 18 months for his cooperation in exposing the larger conspiracy. Turns out he really was as much a victim as anyone else. Langham had convinced him that he was helping to expose corruption, not facilitate it. Agnes set down her teacup with hands that were now steady and sure. David has asked to return to work here when his sentence is completed. I've told him the position will be waiting for him. It seems only fair, considering how badly he was deceived. Dr. Haydock arrived fashionably late, as was his custom, bringing with him the latest news from London regarding the disposition of the recovered artefacts. The War Office has been quite cooperative, actually, he reported as he accepted a slice of seed cake from Mrs. Bantry. Most of the stolen items will be returned to their countries of origin, though the process is expected to take several years. And the monetary value of what was recovered, Miss Marple asked. Considerable. Agnes has decided to donate the entire amount to the War Widows Relief Fund, which should provide substantial assistance to those who genuinely need it. Miss Marple looked approvingly at Agnes, who had chosen to transform her husband's criminal legacy into something genuinely beneficial. A most appropriate use of ill-gotten gains. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Reverend Mr. Pelfrey, who brought with him the sort of gentle good humour that made him welcome at any gathering. "I trust I'm not too late for tea. I've been conducting a small memorial service in the churchyard." "A memorial service?" Agnes inquired. "For Robert Everard. Nothing elaborate, just a brief prayer for the soul of a man who, whatever his faults, chose to do right in the end. I thought it appropriate given the circumstances." Miss Marple felt a small pang of sadness for the man who had walked away into the darkness a month ago. True to his word, Robert Everard had simply vanished, leaving no trace of his final whereabouts. Whether he had died quietly somewhere in the countryside or had managed to find some peaceful refuge for his last days, no one would ever know. "I received a letter from him," Agnes said quietly, "just last week, posted from Dover, though by the time it reached me, the trail had gone cold. He wanted me to know that he bore me no ill will, and that he hoped I would find happiness in my remaining years." "A generous sentiment from a man who had every reason to harbour resentment," observed Dr. Haydock. "I think," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that Robert Everard discovered something that many people never learn, that revenge, no matter how justified it might seem, ultimately poisons the one who seeks it more than the one who deserves it." Inspector Slack consulted his watch and began gathering his things. "I'm afraid I must return to Much Benham. There's been a break-in at the post office that requires investigation. Nothing as dramatic as our recent adventures, I'm pleased to say." After the inspector's departure, the remaining members of the group settled into the comfortable sort of conversation that follows the successful conclusion of a difficult chapter in life. Mrs. Bantry regaled them with village gossip, Doctor. Haydock shared amusing stories from his practice, and the Reverend offered gentle philosophical observations about the nature of forgiveness and redemption. It was as they were preparing to leave that Miss Marple noticed something that made her smile with quiet satisfaction. In a corner of the garden, carefully tended and clearly thriving, was a single blue petunia plant. Unlike its poisonous predecessors, this specimen showed no signs of artificial enhancement or dangerous additives. "Agnes," she said, nodding toward the flower, "I see you've decided to keep a memento of recent events." Agnes followed her gaze and laughed softly. "Doctor, Haydock suggested it might be therapeutic to grow something beautiful from something that had been used for evil purposes. This one is completely harmless, I assure you. No exotic dyes, no dangerous additives, just an ordinary blue petunia that I'm rather fond of." Mrs. Bantry examined the flower with interest. "It's quite lovely, actually. Much more natural looking than those artificial things we saw at poor Thomas's funeral." "I think of it as a reminder," Agnes explained. a reminder that even the most innocent things can be corrupted by evil intentions, but that with care and attention they can be restored to their proper purpose. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. A very wise philosophy, my dear. As the small gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly through the restored garden, reflecting on the complex web of motives and deceptions that had entangled so many lives. The case had begun with what appeared to be a simple matter of forgery and blackmail, but had revealed depths of corruption and betrayal that stretched back to the darkest days of the war. Yet in the end, truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and the innocent had been protected from further harm. It was, Miss Marple reflected, about as satisfactory a conclusion as one could hope for in an imperfect world. "Jane, dear," called Mrs. Bantry from the garden gate, "are you ready to walk back to the village?" "Indeed I am, Dolly." Miss Marple took one last look at the peaceful garden, then moved to join her friend for the pleasant stroll home. As they walked, Mrs. Bantry chattered cheerfully about plans for the upcoming church bazaar and the latest developments in her ongoing battle with the local garden society over the proper pruning of climbing roses. Miss Marple listened with half an ear, her mind already turning to the small mysteries and minor dramas that were the normal fabric of village life. At her garden gate she paused to deadhead a few roses that had begun to fade, then made her way inside to prepare for a quiet evening with her knitting and the latest detective novel from the lending library. Before settling into her favourite chair, however, she took a moment to press a single blue petal between the pages of her diary, beside a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Murder at Rosemount Concluded." Then, with the satisfied smile of someone who had seen justice done and order restored, she picked up her knitting needles and settled in for a peaceful evening. "Gardens," she murmured to herself as she began working on a new scarf for the church charity sale. "Must be allowed a weed or two, else we never notice the flowers."